The autumn light came through the schoolroom windows at an angle that made everything look warmer than it was. The scrubbed pine desks, the chalk-dusted slates, the small hands folded on laps by girls who had been told twice already to sit still. Verity Colston stood at the front of the room with her back straight and her hands clasped and her smile fixed in place. And she did not look at the Duke of Ravensmoor if she could help it. Because looking at Marcus Hale when he was in one of his inspecting moods was like looking directly at a closed door and expecting it to open by force of politeness. He stood to her left with the county magistrate, Mr. Forsyth, and with his cousin Percival beside him. Percival, who had been writing in that small notebook of his since the moment he arrived, and who smiled at the girls with the particular warmth of a man who has no interest in children whatsoever. The room smelled of chalk and damp wool, and the faint sweetness of the apple left on Verity's desk by one of the younger girls that morning. And outside, the wind moved through the beech trees along the lane, and everything was quiet and orderly and about to go badly. The room manages 32 children adequately, Verity said, addressing herself to Mr. Forsyth rather than to the Duke, because Mr. Forsyth at least had the decency to look at her when she spoke. But we have 14 girls on the waiting list this term alone, and the younger ones, those under 8, would benefit considerably from a separate space where the instruction can be calibrated to their level. I have drawn up a proposal for a second schoolroom, which the estate could support without material strain. The timber and labor together would come to less than £40. She paused. She felt, rather than saw, Marcus go still. Miss Colston. His voice was flat and final, the way a bolt sounds when it slides home. You will smile and say nothing. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Verity's smile did not move. It was, if anything, more precisely in place than it had been a moment ago. Not a smile of pleasure or of embarrassment, but a smile of a woman who has decided, in the course of those 3 seconds, exactly what she is going to do next. A second schoolroom, she said, in the same tone she had used the first time, addressing Mr. Forsyth with unhurried clarity, to accommodate the 14 girls currently on the waiting list. The cost to the estate would be less than £40 in timber and labor. I have prepared figures, if the magistrate would care to see them. She heard Percival's pencil scratch against the page of his notebook. Mr. Forsyth, to his credit, cleared his throat. Yes, that sounds quite. The figures would be useful, certainly, Miss Colston. Thank you. Marcus said nothing. He was looking at the window, which was the direction he always looked when he was deciding not to say what he was thinking. And Verity had learned over the years to read that particular angle of his jaw the way one reads weather, not with pleasure, but with accuracy. His jaw was tight. The muscle along it was doing something controlled and precise. Percival was still writing. The girls have been making excellent progress in their letters. Verity continued, because if she was going to be publicly silenced, she was at least going to make the most of not being silenced. And she moved to the nearest desk and lifted the slate belonging to a girl named Ruth, who was 9 years old and already writing in a hand that put most of the boys at the village school to shame. Ruth, would you read what you wrote this morning? Ruth looked at the Duke and then at Verity. And then, with the particular courage of a 9-year-old who trusts her teacher, she read aloud from her slate in a clear, steady voice. A passage she had copied from the schoolroom's single volume of natural history about the migration of swallows. Mr. Forsyth made a sound of genuine approval. Marcus turned from the window and looked at Ruth, and his expression did something that Verity, watching from the corner of her eye, could not quite name. Not softness exactly. Something more guarded than that. something that looked, from a certain angle, like a man being careful not to show what he actually thought. Percival closed his notebook. "Admirable," he said pleasantly. "Quite admirable. The estate is fortunate to have such a dedicated mistress." He said the word mistress with a small, precise emphasis that meant nothing and everything. And Verity met his eyes and held them until he looked away first, which he did, though without hurry. The inspection concluded in the way inspections at Fairhaven always concluded, with Mr. Forsyth making approving noises about the register and the cleanliness of the room, with Marcus asking 2 questions about the roof in the tone of a man who already knows the answers and is merely establishing that he has asked them, and with Percival standing slightly apart from the rest and observing everything with the patient, collecting attention of a man building a case for something he has not yet named. When they filed out into the yard, Verity stood at the schoolroom door with her hands folded and watched them go. The girls were released for their midday meal at 11:30, and the sound of their feet on the yard stones faded down the lane, and Verity was left alone in the schoolroom with the chalk dust and the apple and the particular quality of silence that follows children like a tide going out. She began straightening the room. It was not necessary, strictly speaking. The girls had left it orderly enough. But her hands wanted something to do, and the act of realigning slates on their hooks and pushing benches back to their proper angles was the kind of task that required just enough attention to prevent her from thinking too precisely about the morning. She worked from the back of the room forward, methodically, and when she reached the front, she paused with a slate in her hand and stood still for a moment. The door opened. One of the elder girls, Clara, 16, the daughter of the estate's head groom, appeared in the frame with her dinner pail in her hand and a question she had clearly been composing since before she left. "Miss Colston," Clara said, "will it be built, the second room?" Verity set the slate on its hook. "I don't know," she said. Clara looked at her with the particular directness of a girl who has grown up around horses and has little patience for evasion. "But you asked." "I asked," Verity agreed. "And the Duke said no." "The Duke said," Verity replied carefully, "that I should smile and say nothing, which I considered and decided against." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father says the Duke doesn't like being disagreed with." "Most people don't," Verity said. "That has never struck me as a good reason to stop doing it." Clara nodded slowly, in the way of someone filing information away for future use, and disappeared back into the yard. Verity stood in the empty room and listened to the wind in the beeches. She did not hear his footsteps. She had never, in 3 years, managed to hear Marcus Hale approaching before he was already there. But she became aware of him in the way she always did, which was a particular change in the quality of the light through the window, as though the shadow of something large and deliberate had passed. She turned. He was at the window. He was at the, not stopped, moving past, coat dark against the pale autumn sky, his stride the same unhurried, contained thing it always was. He did not look into the room. He did not slow. He passed the window and was gone, and the yard beyond was empty again, and the light went back to what it had been. Verity thought, as she sometimes did when she was not carefully preventing herself from doing so, of a morning 2 winters ago. Ice on the yard stones, a frost that had come overnight without warning, and Marcus arriving for a quarterly review of the school's accounts. The only time he ever came alone, without an entourage of stewards and ledgers. She had been crossing the yard to meet him, and her foot had gone from under her on the step, and his hand had been at her elbow before she had fully registered that she was falling. There and gone in a single motion. So swift and certain that she had stood steadied on the step for a moment afterward, with the feeling of it still on her arm and nothing to attach it to, because he was already 2 paces away, asking her something about the quarterly figures in exactly the tone he always used. She had thought about it, intermittently, for 2 years. She had also, intermittently, told herself this was foolish. Down the lane, Percival Hale's carriage moved between the beeches. She could see it from the doorway, the dark shape of it diminishing in the pale afternoon light. Percival's profile visible for a moment in the window before it turned the bend and was gone. Verity watched it disappear. She could not have said exactly what it was she felt watching it go. Not relief, not quite. Something more like the awareness that a day which had begun in one way had shifted, somewhere in the middle of it, into something else, and that she had not yet worked out what the something else was. She went back inside and finished straightening the room. That evening, Verity walked to Ravensmoor. She had composed, in the 2 hours between the end of the school day and the moment she put on her coat, several versions of what she intended to say. Each one more precise than the last, each one discarding the elements that felt like pleading and retaining only the elements that felt like argument, which was the version of herself she trusted most in situations like this. The estate house was a 1/4 mile from Fairhaven along the main lane, and by the time she arrived, the light had gone blue, and the windows of the ground floor were lit from within. And the footman who opened the door to her, a young man named George, who had once been a pupil at the village school and retained, in Verity's presence, a slightly guilty expression, showed her to the estate office without being asked. Marcus was at his desk. The office was a room that reflected its occupant with unsettling accuracy. Large, cold, ordered, containing no object that did not serve a purpose. The fire had burned down to a moderate, efficient level. The desk held papers arranged in the geometry of someone who thinks in systems. Marcus himself was in his shirt sleeves, which was the closest Verity had ever seen him to informal. And he looked up when she entered with an expression that gave nothing away, which was the expression he always wore, and which she had spent 3 years attempting to read past. "Miss Colston," he said. "Your Grace," she said. "I would like to discuss this morning." "Sit down, then." "I'd rather stand," she said. A pause. He set down his pen. "As you prefer." "You told me to smile and say nothing," Verity said. "In front of the county magistrate, in front of your cousin, who was writing everything down in a notebook. You said it as though it were an instruction I might reasonably be expected to follow. I am aware of what I said. And you are not going to apologize for it." He answered without hesitation and without cruelty. "No." "The proposal was reasonable," she said. "The cost is modest. The need is documented. Mr. Forsyth saw the waiting list himself. And you dismissed it, dismissed me, in front of the one man in this county with the authority to make difficulties for this school. Mr. Forsyth will not make difficulties for the school. No, but Percival might." Something shifted in Marcus's face. Not much. A fractional tightening, gone almost before it was there. "Percival," he said, "is my concern, not yours." "He was writing in that notebook every time I spoke," Verity said. "Every time. Not when you spoke, not when Mr. Forsyth spoke, when I spoke. And you told me to be quiet, which means either you want me to be quiet, or you wanted him to see you telling me to be quiet, and I cannot decide which of those is worse." Silence. She had meant to say more. She had composed 3 further points, each one well evidenced, but something in the room had changed, a quality to the silence that was different from the silence at the beginning of the conversation, and her eye moved, without her entirely meaning it to to the desk. The steward's minute book was lying open to the left of Marcus's blotter. It was a large, cloth-bound volume that she had seen in Thomas Garth's hands at estate meetings, and she had always assumed it contained the kind of information that did not concern her. Drainage reports, timber assessments, quarterly accounts. But it was lying open, and the entry at the top of the left page was dated the 14th of September, last month, and the subject of the entry was the schoolroom proposal. Her schoolroom proposal. She crossed to the desk before she had decided to, and read the margin. Approved. VC as proposed. 14th of September. The handwriting was not Thomas Garth's. She knew Marcus's hand from the quarterly accounts he signed. Compact, angular, entirely legible. This was the same hand. She stood with her eyes on the page and felt something rearrange itself in her chest, with the slow, inexorable quality of furniture being moved in a dark room. She looked up. Marcus was watching her read. He had not moved. He was watching her with the same expression he always wore. Closed, contained, giving nothing away, except that he was watching her with an attention that was not the attention of a man who does not care what she thinks. It was the attention of a man who is waiting to see what she will do with what she has just found. She looked back at the page, then at him. "How long?" she said. He did not answer. "This entry," she said. "The second schoolroom. I proposed it in August. You told me it was outside the estate's priorities." She paused. "How many entries are there?" He said nothing. He did not look away. Verity stood in the cold office with the minute book open in front of her and looked at Marcus Hale for a long moment, and did not yet know whether what she felt was closer to relief or to anger, and was not at all certain those were different things. In the weeks that followed, she tested it. It was not a dignified thing to do, and she was aware of that. But she had spent 3 years assuming she was tolerated, a useful inconvenience at the edge of the estate's concerns. And the margin note had disturbed that assumption in a way she could not simply set aside, and the only way she knew how to investigate a thing was directly. She began making proposals in public. At the October estate meeting, attended by the steward and 2 of the tenant farmers, she mentioned in passing that the lane between Fairhaven and the village had drainage problems that would worsen through winter. She mentioned it as an observation, not a request, and watched Marcus's face give nothing away, and went home and waited. The drainage was repaired within the fortnight. No note was sent. No acknowledgement was made. The work simply appeared one morning. Done. She wrote a letter to the estate about a book order for the school, French grammar, 2 copies, which she needed and had been waiting 3 months to request formally, and mentioned the need in front of the steward during a routine visit. The books arrived in 8 days. She had not submitted the formal request. She changed the school's daily calendar, earlier start, longer midday break for the girls who walked from the far end of the estate, and mentioned the change aloud at the school gate when Marcus was riding past on his way to the lower fields. He did not stop. He did not acknowledge that he had heard. 3 days later, Thomas Garth came to tell her that the morning cart that brought the estate workers' children would be adjusted to the new schedule. She stood in the schoolroom doorway after Garth left and looked at the yard and thought, with a precision that surprised her, he has been listening to everything. The broken window was the last piece. It was a small pane in the schoolroom's north wall, cracked through by a stone flung from the lane. She had mentioned it to no one, had simply noted it in her own record as something to address when funds permitted. She came in one Monday morning to find it replaced, the putty still faintly soft, no note left anywhere. She sat down at her desk and did not move for a full minute. She stopped telling herself it was coincidence. Percival came back to the estate twice in the following month, each time with the air of a man conducting a pleasant social visit and the eyes of someone conducting a survey. The second time, he stopped at Fairhaven on his way to the house and spoke to Verity in the yard with great warmth about the school's progress and the Duke's generosity in supporting it, and asked several questions about how decisions regarding the school's expenditures were typically reached, who initiated them, how they were communicated, who approved them. Verity answered him with the same pleasant precision she brought to every conversation she did not trust, and told him nothing he could use, and watched him write in his notebook afterward. The third visit, he brought a solicitor. It was on a Tuesday, and Verity knew about it only because Clara mentioned it in the morning. Her father had seen the carriage arrive the previous evening with a second man inside, thin and carrying a document case. Verity filed this information and said nothing and went about the day's lessons and thought, with increasing clarity, that whatever Percival was building, he was close to finished building it. That afternoon, she was walking the lane between Fairhaven and the estate. She made this walk most days to collect the post that came to the estate house for one of a Fairhaven address. When she heard Marcus's footsteps behind her and turned to find him there, which was unusual enough that she stopped. "You've seen the solicitor's carriage," she said, because she had learned over 3 years that waiting for Marcus to begin a conversation was a way of growing old. "I have," he said. "And Percival." "Percival is my cousin," he said, in the tone he used when he was saying something that was technically true and entirely beside the point. "He is asking about the school's expenditures," Verity said. "He asked me who initiates them. He is building a record of something. Leave Percival to me." "You keep saying that," Verity said, as though it is an answer. They were walking now. She had not decided to walk, but he had moved forward, and she had fallen into step beside him, which was the way it always went. The lane was narrow between its hedges, and the wind came along it in cold, channeled gusts, and Verity's cloak caught it badly, and she reached up to close it and found Marcus's hand already there. Not reaching for her hand, reaching for the clasp at her collarbone, his fingers settling the wool against the wind with the same quiet certainty with which he did everything. And she went still. His fingers rested at her collarbone for a moment that the wind did not require. "Why?" she said carefully. "Will you do every single thing I propose and refuse to acknowledge any of it?" He did not remove his hand immediately. When he did, it was deliberate, a withdrawal, not an accident. "Because acknowledgement costs something," he said, "that silence does not." "It costs me something," she said. "Every time you say nothing, in front of every person who watches you say nothing, it costs me something." He looked at her. The wind moved in the hedge. His jaw was set in that controlled, deliberate way that meant he was deciding not to say what he was actually thinking. "I know it," he said, and walked on. The Chancery petition arrived on a Thursday morning in November, delivered by a court messenger who came to Ravensmoor on a gray horse, and left the document with the footman, and was gone before Marcus had finished his breakfast. Verity learned of it from a note, delivered to Fairhaven by a boy of about 12, who handed it to her in the yard with the solemnity of someone transporting something important, and waited to see if there was a reply. The note was in Marcus's hand, compact, angular, entirely legible, and contained a date and the words, "You are not named as respondent. You need not come." She read it. She read it again. Then she set it on her desk beside the apple Ruth had left that morning. A new one the girl had taken to leaving them weekly, a habit Verity had not discouraged. And she sat down and thought about what it meant that Marcus had written to tell her she need not come, and what it meant that he had written to tell her at all, and what it meant that his first instinct, upon receiving a document that threatened his guardianship of 3 children he had spent a decade protecting, was to write to her. She reached for her own papers and began gathering them. The county paper ran its piece 10 days later. It did not name her. It was careful about that. Careful in the way that things written by people who know exactly what they are doing are always careful. It described Fairhaven School as a household indulgence sustained by a duke susceptible to sentimental persuasion from persons of no standing. And it went on for 2 columns in this register, combining just enough factual accuracy with just enough implication to be both unactionable and devastating. Within the week, 2 families removed their daughters. The mothers came separately on different mornings and said different things with the same apologetic firmness. One cited concerns about the school's stability. The other cited her husband's wishes. And Verity thanked them both and saw them out, and went back inside and stood in the room where their daughters' desks now stood empty, and did not permit herself, for the remainder of the school day, to feel anything that would have shown on her face in front of the remaining girls. She stopped writing to the estate. She stopped appearing at the school gate on mornings when Marcus rode past the lane. The withdrawal was total and deliberate, and she was aware that it was also, in some part, cowardice. But she could not yet look at him without the anger rising in a way she did not trust herself to manage. And she had 30 girls who needed her to be managing. So she managed and kept her distance, and told herself this was the sensible course. He did not come to the school. He did not send another note. He gave her the distance she had created, which was either respect or indifference. And she could not, at this particular moment, tell the difference. Thomas Garth came on a Wednesday afternoon without announcement and knocked on the schoolroom door after the girls had gone home. He was a compact, weathered man of 50 who had served the Ravensmoor estate for 23 years and who expressed emotion primarily through the degree of compression in his jaw, which was currently at a level Verity had not previously observed. "I've read what the paper printed," he said without preamble. "So has most of the county," Verity said. "It is a lie," Garth said. "Not an exaggeration, a lie. I have the minute book, Miss Colston. I have kept it in full since the day I took this position, and every entry is dated and initialed, and I will swear to every one of them under oath, if you will let me." Verity looked at him. "You understand what that means," she said. "If you testify at the hearing, you are taking a position against your employer's cousin in a legal proceeding." "My employer," Garth said, with a precision that made the word carry considerable weight, "has spent 10 years doing right by this estate, those children, and this school, and has said nothing about any of it because he thought silence was safer. I have watched it, and I have recorded it, and I am done watching it be used against him by a man who has never once done a useful thing with his hands." He paused. "So, will you let me?" Verity was quiet for a moment. She answered him plainly. "Yes." The formal summons arrived at Fairhaven on a Friday evening, delivered this time by a different messenger, a court officer in dark coat, very correct, who required her signature on a receipt and gave her a copy of the hearing date in York. She stood in the doorway with the document in her hand and read it in the last of the daylight. And then she put on her coat and walked to Ravensmoor. The house was quiet. George let her in without a word, and she went to the estate office and found Marcus alone with the fire burned down low and the petition open on the desk in front of him, and 3 candles lit around it in the way of a man who has been reading the same document repeatedly without it telling him anything new. He looked up when she came in. He did not look surprised. She crossed to the desk and stood on the opposite side of it and looked at him. At the petition, at the fire, at his hands on the desk. And she was frightened for the school and furious with him for 10 years of silence and every margin note that had ever been made in secret. And she reached across the desk and took his hand before either of them had decided to allow it. His hand was cold. He did not pull back. "The children," she said. "Tell me they are not frightened." "They don't know about the petition," he said. "Eleanor asked me yesterday why Percival visited so many times. I told her he was managing some family business." "Is that what you're calling it?" "It's what it is," he said. "He wants the trust income. He has always wanted the trust income. The children are the mechanism. I am the obstacle." "And I am the evidence," Verity said. He looked at their hands on the desk. "Yes," he said. "Then we had better be worth it," she said. He looked up at her then, and something in his face shifted in a way she had not seen before. Not the controlled, precise thing she was accustomed to reading, but something underneath that. Something that had been behind the door for a very long time and was now, with considerable reluctance and no particular grace, beginning to come through. She let go of his hand and went home and did not sleep much. And in the morning she arranged for Thomas Garth to travel to York with the minute book, and packed her own papers and hired a seat on the public coach. They traveled separately, as was proper and as was necessary, and arrived in York in the early evening when the city was settling into its winter dark and the inn yards were lit with lanterns and the smell of coal smoke came off the rooftops in gray streams. The hearing was set for 10 the following morning. Verity ate supper alone in the inn's small dining room and went over her papers until the candle had burned to a stub. And then she put on her coat and went into the courtyard for air because the room was close and the papers had begun to swim. And she stood in the cold with her breath making small clouds and looked at the lantern above the gate and thought about 30 girls and 2 empty desks and a broken window repaired overnight with no note left. She heard his footsteps on the cobblestones and turned. Marcus had his coat on and his hands in his pockets, and the expression of a man who has come outside for reasons he has not fully decided to articulate. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at the lantern and then at her. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "At the hearing. I told you. I know what you told me," Verity said. "I have the note." "Then you know that you are not named as respondent and have no legal obligation." "Marcus," she said. He stopped. She had never, in 3 years, used his given name. She was aware of this. She was also aware that it had come out with a naturalness that surprised her, as though it had been waiting in her mouth for the right moment and had simply decided this was it. He looked at her. "The minute book," she said. "The entries. Every proposal I made that you adopted in silence. Why did you write them down? You didn't have to. Garth didn't have to. You could have simply done them and left no record." He was quiet for a moment. The lantern swung slightly in the wind. "Because you deserve to be on record," he said. "Even if I couldn't put you there publicly, even if I could only—" He stopped, started again. "I thought if there was ever a time when it mattered, when the school needed defending or you needed defending, there would be something to show. I didn't anticipate Percival using it in the other direction." "You were protecting me," Verity said. "Badly," he said. "As it turns out. You were protecting me by pretending I didn't matter." He said it without flinching. "Yes. It was cowardice," he said. "Not malice. I want you to know that. I was afraid that if Percival saw me agree with you, publicly, on record, in the way that would have given you what you deserved, He would have had what he needed 2 years ago, and the children would have lost their home. I told myself the silence was for them. It was also for me. Because silence is easier than standing in a room and saying aloud that a woman with no rank and no fortune is the best judge of what this school needs, and that I have known it for years, and that I would rather the world knew it than not. He paused. I was wrong about that last part. I should like to correct it, if you will permit me. Verity looked at him in the cold lamplight. She kissed him before he finished the sentence. It was not a tentative thing. She had never, in 3 years, done anything tentatively where Marcus Hale was concerned, and she was not about to begin now. His hands came up to her face with the same quality of certainty that had been in his hand at her elbow on the icy step 2 winters ago. There, deliberate, absolutely present. And when she drew back, he kept his hands where they were for a moment, as though he was making sure she was real. "Tomorrow," she said. He held her gaze steadily. "Tomorrow," he agreed. The York hearing room was not large, but it was full. Percival had brought his solicitor and 2 supporting witnesses, a neighboring landowner who had attended one of the estate inspections, and a clergyman from the county who had been at a meeting where Marcus had, apparently, referred to Fairhaven School as adequate in a tone that Percival's solicitor intended to characterize as dismissive. The magistrate was a compact, careful man named Alderton, who had the look of someone who has heard a great many petitions and has become skilled at distinguishing those with substance from those without. Verity sat in the gallery with Thomas Garth beside her and the minute book on the bench between them, wrapped in cloth against the cold of the morning. Percival presented his case with the smoothness of a man who has rehearsed it many times. He spoke about guardianship and the responsibilities of a man in the Duke's position toward the children in his care. He spoke about the importance of clear authority and undivided judgment. He quoted, at some length and with visible satisfaction, a series of occasions on which Marcus had publicly corrected, dismissed, or overridden Verity's proposals. The school inspection, a parish meeting the previous spring, a letter in which Marcus had apparently described her request for additional funds as premature. He presented these as evidence of a man in full command of his household, exercising appropriate authority over a member of staff who had, in Percival's account, developed a troubling habit of exceeding her proper sphere. He was building to something, and everyone in the room could feel it. "The concern," Percival's solicitor said, addressing Magistrate Alderton with the measured gravity of a man presenting a well-constructed argument, "is not that the Duke is a man of poor character. The concern is that his judgment, specifically in matters relating to his household and his ward's estate, has become susceptible to influence from a quarter that is, by any reasonable standard, inappropriate to the gravity of the decisions involved. Miss Colston is a woman of no rank, no fortune, and no legal standing in this matter. And yet the evidence suggests that the Duke's management of the estate school has been, in material ways, guided by her preferences rather than by his own independent assessment." Alderton looked at Marcus. "Your Grace?" Marcus was seated at the respondent's table with his own solicitor, and he had been, for the duration of Percival's presentation, entirely still. The stillness of a man who is listening to something he is prepared for and is not going to be provoked by. He began to answer, and then Verity stood up. She did not raise her voice. She said clearly and to the magistrate, "I beg the court's pardon. I have evidence I would ask leave to submit." Alderton looked at her over his spectacles. "You are?" "Miss Verity Colston," she said, "headmistress of Fairhaven School. I am not named as a respondent in this petition, but I am named as its central evidence, and I have documentation I believe the court should see before reaching any conclusion about the Duke's judgment or mine." A pause. Percival's solicitor began to object, and Alderton held up one hand. "You may approach," Alderton said. Verity came down from the gallery with Thomas Garth behind her, and she set the minute book on the clerk's table and unwrapped it. And Garth stepped forward and identified himself and stated his position and offered to be sworn. And Alderton swore him in with the brisk efficiency of a man who recognizes when a proceeding is about to become more interesting than it began. The entries were read aloud by the clerk. All of them. Every one that Garth had marked. 43 entries, spanning 3 years, each one dated and initialed, each one recording the adoption of a proposal that had been publicly attributed to no one, or attributed to the estate's own assessment, or simply implemented without attribution at all. The drainage repair, the book order, the calendar change, the window, the schoolroom heating arrangement she had suggested the previous winter, the expanded register she had proposed in a letter she had half expected to be ignored. 43 entries, and beside each one, in Marcus's hand, VC as proposed, or VC adopted, or on 3 occasions simply VC. Initials alone, as though the name behind them was sufficient and required no further explanation. The room was very quiet. Percival's solicitor had stopped writing. "Your petition," Magistrate Alderton said to Percival, after the last entry had been read, "presents the Duke's public dismissals of Miss Colston as evidence of clear, independent authority. The record before me suggests that every dismissal cited was followed, within days, by the private adoption of the dismissed proposal." He looked at the minute book, then at Percival. "Would you care to address that?" Percival addressed it. He did so for several minutes, with diminishing conviction and increasing precision of language that indicated a man trying to find solid ground and discovering that what he had taken for solid ground was in fact the edge of something much less stable. His solicitor assisted. Together they argued that the private adoption of proposals did not constitute improper influence, that a man could consider an idea privately without endorsing its source publicly, that the Duke's public conduct remained the relevant standard. They were not wrong exactly, but they were no longer winning. Magistrate Alderton turned to Marcus. "Your Grace, is there anything you wish to say for the record?" Marcus stood. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the magistrate. And then he looked at Percival. And then, briefly, once, he looked at Verity, and she saw something in his face that she recognized from the courtyard the night before. The thing that had been behind the door coming fully through at last. "I wish to say," Marcus said, "that the minute book is accurate. Every entry is accurate, and I wish to say for the record that I was wrong, not in what I did, but in how I did it. I implemented Miss Colston's proposals in private because I believed that acknowledging them publicly would give my cousin the evidence he has now brought to this court regardless. I told myself this was protection. It was not. It was a failure of honesty toward a woman who had earned honesty by every action she has taken in the management of that school, and by every proposal she made that I was too cautious to endorse openly." He paused. "I intend to correct that. Beginning now, and in every public context that follows, whatever it costs the reputation I built to avoid this moment. Miss Colston's judgment has guided Fairhaven School for 3 years, and it has been sound, and I should have said so plainly on any number of occasions when I instead said nothing. I will not make that error again." The room held its breath. Percival was looking at his solicitor. His solicitor was looking at his papers. Neither of them looked at Verity. Magistrate Alderton reviewed the minute book for another few minutes in silence, making notes in his own hand. Then he set his pen down and looked at the room. "The petition," he said, "relies substantially on a pattern of public conduct that the documentary record demonstrates to be a deliberate performance rather than a genuine reflection of the Duke's household governance. I find insufficient grounds to remove the guardianship. The school is not named as a liability in my order. The children remain in the Duke's care." He closed his ledger. "We are adjourned." The sound that followed was not dramatic. Chairs moved, solicitors gathered papers. Percival stood and straightened his coat and looked for a moment at Marcus. And Marcus looked back at him with the expression of a man who has nothing further to prove and no particular interest in gloating. And Percival turned and left, and his solicitor followed, and the room began to empty in the ordinary way of rooms that have finished their business. Thomas Garth picked up the minute book and held it with both hands and said nothing, which was his way of saying a great deal. Verity stood by the clerk's table and looked at Marcus across the room. He crossed to her. He did not say anything immediately, which was also, she had come to understand, his way of saying a great deal. "The second schoolroom," she said. £40 in timber and labor," he said. "I know. I have the figures." She looked at him. "You have always had the figures," he answered without apology. "Yes." "You are insufferable," she said. "I know that too," he said. And something in his face did what she had waited 3 years to see it do. It opened, fully and without reservation, into something that was not a smile exactly, but was the thing that precedes a smile in a man who has not smiled freely in a very long time. She took his arm, and they walked out of the York hearing room together into the cold November air. And it was, by any reasonable measure, the most public thing either of them had ever done. 1 year later, the second schoolroom at Fairhaven stood open. It had been built over the summer, timber and lime-washed plaster, and 2 good windows on the south side that let in the afternoon light. And it smelled of new wood and chalk, and the particular combination of small boots and concentrated effort that Verity had come to think of as the smell of something working. The elder girls taught the younger ones their letters in the mornings and in the afternoons. Verity moved between the 2 rooms, and the waiting list was gone. And Ruth, who was 10 now and had moved on to history, was teaching a girl of 6 to form her name on a slate with the patient, exacting manner of someone who has learned from a good teacher. Clara's father had built the benches. He had charged the estate half what they were worth. And when Verity had pointed this out, he had told her the other half was his contribution to the education of his daughter, who was now, he said with visible satisfaction, better read than he was. At dusk on a Tuesday in October, Verity was in the original schoolroom settling the slates for the morning. The same task, the same room, the same low autumn light coming through the same windows at the same useful angle. When she heard footsteps in the yard, Marcus came through the door of the new room first, checking that the windows were latched against the night, a thing he had taken to doing on evenings when the weather was turning. She watched him through the connecting doorway without announcing herself. He moved through the new room with the same unhurried, contained quality he brought to everything. And when he had satisfied himself about the windows, he went to the small table in the corner where the schoolroom's single lamp stood and lit it, and set it on the sill where it would be visible from the lane. He had been doing this since the room opened. He had not explained it. She had not asked. He turned from the lamp, and she was in the doorway. And for a moment they simply looked at each other across the width of the new room. The chalk-dusted slates on their hooks, the benches in their rows, the lamp burning on the sill against the dark outside. "The drainage on the east lane," she said. It will need attention before winter." "I know," he said. "I'm mentioning it publicly," she said, "so that you can address it publicly, and we can both be seen to have been in agreement about it from the start." "Noted," he said, and crossed the room to her, and she did not move from the doorway. And when he reached her, he took her face in his hands the way he had in the York courtyard, with that same quality of absolute, unhurried certainty, and kissed her in the lamplight of the room they had argued over for 3 years. Outside, the beech trees moved in the October wind, and the lamp burned steadily on the sill. And somewhere on the lane, a cart went past, with its lantern swinging, and the door of Fairhaven School closed quietly against the evening.